Before you derp, make sure you're fully equipped. Hello everyone, I'm Bront, CatHerder, and welcome to my channel. We're talking Raid Shadow Legends and having fun derping through Faction Wars. So I've done a couple of videos on Faction Wars so far. I've focused on the individual factions, and I've talked about what derp means, which I should definitely go through again. Derping is my method for building teams. It involves damage, so you can kill your enemies. It involves enhancers, so buffs to you and debuffs to your enemies. It involves revivers to bring you back to life. And it involves protectors, heals, buffs, and control, ideally so you don't need the revivers quite often. Overall, it is a great strategy for dealing with faction wars. It helps you look for what you're looking for in your team. It gives you an idea of what type of champions you're looking to build and how many of each type of champion you're looking to build. And overall, you need to make sure you cover up all these goals. You need damage, you need the enhancers, you need the protectors, you need the revivers. And if for some reason you don't need one of those, it's because you overcompensated somewhere else. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with building something that doesn't need a reviver or something that doesn't need a protector. And eventually you can do it almost entirely with damage. But getting through your first time with 3 stars, you're going to need to derp. So let's take a look at what gear it takes to build the champions and what you're looking for as far as stats. Okay, so I have a, bit of a breakdown on the enemy stats per floor. And as you can see, after floors 1 through 3, it's about every 5 floors they go up in difficulty. This is a bit of an approximation because floor 4 is not quite as rough as floor 9, obviously. But overall, if you have these stats, you should have no problem on most of those floors. Now, most of the enemies are around speed 90 to 100 on floors 1 through 3. They can fluctuate a little bit. They have very little resistance at 30 and have no accuracy. However, you'll notice I also have the recommended stats next to that. Recommended speed, honestly, floor 1 through 3, you just want to be running it and putting champions in there, and eventually you should be able to kill those floors pretty easily with just a few champions. Early on, you don't need to focus on faction wars, so you'll just be running it with whatever champions you happen to have. You might even throw some gear on some of them, and some of them may not be geared, and that's fine. So yes, you'd like some speed on some of your champions. No, you do not care about resistance early on. Honestly, there's very little reason to care about resistance in faction wars, but sometimes people like to, so I figured I'd put it in there. And accuracy, yes, if you need accuracy, you're going to want about 55 points in accuracy, but you don't need an awful lot of accuracy. In fact, oftentimes without that, you'll just naturally get it through some of the substats you might roll up on the skills, as well as things like your rate haul that you should be working on. Floors 4 through 9, that's where you start actually needing to deal with the gear a little bit more. Champions speed up, so they get to about speed 90 to 120. And the reason for the range is, for the most part, the champions, and you'll see it goes all the way to floor 16 through 20, most of the champions don't actually change much as far as their speed goes. So they're generally going base speed, if not just a little bit faster. So you tend to have champions that are at least level 90 as far as speed goes. Some champions are naturally around 115, so I went up to 120 for rounding. However, you'll notice the recommended speed I have there is approximately 140 or higher. It's just a matter of, you want to be going fast and taking more turns. And as things get more difficult, you want to take more turns and more turns and more turns and go faster and faster and faster. And it means a lot to you. Resistance, they're 50 to 65 is generally where they're at. Some are 50, some are 65. Again, it's pretty natural resistance. Accuracy is the same. There's really no reason, again, to build resistance, but if you do, you need at least 205 to really be useful. And as far as accuracy is concerned, you're looking for about 85 or more. At 85 or more, will land your debuffs on just about every champion all the time. Once you get to floors 10 through 15, floor 7 is the first boss, floor 14 is the second boss, so 10 through 15 gets you through the second boss and starts getting you where you start getting really good rewards. That's where you start getting 5 and 6 star glyphs, and that's where you start getting the ability to craft legendary 5-star and 6-star perception and resilience gear. Getting to floor 15 is kind of important. It's well worth pushing to get to floor 15, and then if you slow down a little bit to build up some more gear, that's fine. Again, the speeds are 90 to 120. The resistances go up to about 100 to 110. Same with the accuracy. So as far as the speed's concerned, you're really looking closer to about 260. And again, that's an average speed. That's not necessarily every champion's going to be that. Some of your damage dealers may be a little bit slower, and I'll get to that when we talk about champions you're building a little later. Resistance is still really hard to build. 250 really early on is really hard to build. The accuracy 125, however, is pretty achievable by 10 floors 10 to 15, especially if you have been focusing on accuracy in your Great Hall. Hopefully, by then you've gotten a lot of these things up to level 5 or 6, where you've gotten 40 accuracy just out of the Great Hall in and of itself, and the Great Hall is great for that. Moving on to floors 16 through 20, again, we've got the speeds of 90 to 120. The resistances are your 200 to 220. Same with the accuracy. So I recommend about 180 speed being kind of your average around these floors. You may even want to move up to the 200. I recommend for the boss floor, when you get to around from floor 19 and 20, 19 and 20 can be very problematic for you. That's generally the best of the best floors. And in some stages, floor 19 or floor 20 is actually harder than floor 21. So you're looking for your 180 speed, you're looking for your resistance about 325, and your accuracy about 245. Now you can go a little bit lower on the accuracy to about 225, but you'll notice some of the resistances are as high as 220. So you're going to find that most champions, you're going to be able to land all your debuffs on. Occasionally you might get resisted if you're at 225. Getting up to 245 gives you less than 5% resistance rate, so you should be good to go. Keep in mind that accuracy, as high as you ever get it, you'll never get better than a 3% resistance rate, because that's the way the game is programmed. So there's always a 3% chance that you can get resisted. Finally, on the bosses have different speeds. The slowest boss being about 145, and the fastest boss or some of the minions were about 165. So that is worth tracking. They're obviously faster, and that's why at least a 200 speed is very important. Um, Again, with speed, the faster the speed, the faster you go. In general, if you have a 100 speed champion and a 200 speed champion, the 200 speed champion will go approximately twice as often as the 100 speed champion. So there's a reason that looking for possibly being as fast as double the enemy speed can be very, very helpful. And against the bosses, some of the bosses have ways to speed themselves up. Some of the bosses just take a lot of turns and will sometimes just instantly kill somebody. Some of the bosses will actually take extra turns. So there's reasons for you to worry about the speed of your champions and want champions to take more than one turn per rotation of the boss. So definitely worth looking at some of the higher speeds. Again, the boss's accuracy and resistance, generally back to the 200-ish. So 225 accuracy, better, 245 is better overall for the waves. And then the same with the resistance, the 325. If you're building resistance for the bosses, this is where you're going to start focusing on resistance. But again, building resistance is difficult until you get into the late game. So honestly, I would recommend not worry about resistance too much. But that's the stats per floor. So this is to give you just a general idea of some of the stats you will need when you're building your champions. Now we're going to go into how I would build the different types of champions, your damage dealers, your protectors, your revivers, your enhancers, so that you can derp properly. And I won't have the specific numbers on those because I'm more going to have general numbers of things you're looking for. If there's a specific number, I'm definitely going to mention it. But otherwise, I'm assuming you're out talking about for floor 21, so I'm kind of aiming for that. So talking damage dealers, we're looking at two different types of damage dealers. You have direct damage dealers and you have indirect damage dealers. So direct damage dealers are the ones where they hit the other team and they do damage. The indirect damage dealers are the ones that do damage through things like poison or burning, or sometimes they're reflecting damage, although that's usually much rarer of a thing. But generally poison and burning are kind of where your indirect damage dealers come from. So you build them very differently, and generally your indirect damage dealers are also probably falling under some other category as well, because that's generally what makes them particularly useful. So keep that in mind when building an indirect damage dealer. But what you're looking for in a direct damage dealer is you want your crit rate to be 100%. This is important for arena nukers. This is important for any damage dealer on the waves. You want them to be 100% chance to crit. You're talking about running content again and again and again, and you're looking for consistent victories. Now, in Faction Wars, you can certainly play the odds a little bit and take a chance with a lower crit rate. But keep in mind, you could have a great run that could fail because you expected somebody to crit and they didn't crit because you only had a 95% crit rate. The 95% crit rate means that 5% of the time they're not critting. And that, of course, ignores the fact that you also have things like weak hits, which will prevent you from critting, and other stuff like that. So you want your damage dealers to always crit all the time, because you then want to be able to multiply their damage with the crit damage multiplier. Crit damage is an addition to the standard damage that they already do. So if you have a champion with 150% crit damage, they're doing 150% more damage than they were when they would have not crit. So that's how important crits can be. And you can get 200% crit damage. You can get 300% crit damage. Unlikely early on, but crit damage is a big, big deal as far as damage goes. Also, you want to pay attention to the damage stat of your direct damage dealer. So if it's a defense-based champion, make sure they're doing damage based off of defense. If they're sometimes they don't. For example, Seeker is actually a damage champion that can do a decent amount of damage, and he's a defensive champion, but his damage stat on his only damage skill is attack. So keep that in mind. Check the actual skills, find out what stats do damage. Those are the stats you want to focus on as far as what you're doing with those champions. As far as speed is concerned, your damage dealers can be a little bit slower, and that's because your damage dealers need to do damage, and it's really hard to get all those additional stats. They're the ones that are the most stat hungry. So they can be a little bit slower, but that also means that that's why you want the enhancers to help enhance the damage by doing things like decrease defense or increase attack or any of those buffs or debuffs like that. So you want their damage stat to be high, but the speed can be a little slower so that they can wait for their supports to get around to do the boosts that they need. So your Ward Maiden, for example, does the decreased defense before your damage dealer and barbarians then does their AoE attack and hits somebody, and then they hit on lower defense, so they do more damage, and then the crit does more damage, and so it all stacks up, and it can make for a much faster run and a much safer run as well, because you can kill things faster. And then finally, accuracy if needed. And I put that in there because depending on the damage dealer, some damage dealers are really good at debuffing, and so you may want to actually have the accuracy in there. For example, you have a Tyrell who does a decent amount of damage, but is also a debuffer with decreased defense. He's worth building for damage as a direct damage dealer with high accuracy, although you probably then want to give him some more speed. Whereas a Solus, for example, has some additional buffs for having accuracy, but as far as Faction Wars is concerned, you may decide to not worry about accuracy and just give him additional damage. For the high damage champions, quite often you ignore accuracy. For the lower damage champions that bring a lot of extra stuff with the accuracy, you want to deal with the accuracy. Also, champions that are direct damage dealers but also use debuffs. For example, Azavia is a poison dealer who also can blow up those poisons, so you need the accuracy to lay the poisons in the first place. But if you build them for direct damage, they will also just flat out smack. So you can do accuracy with direct damage. Whereas a Magnar doesn't have anything particularly exciting for his debuffs, so I wouldn't bother building accuracy on a Magnar. So that's where you're focused with a direct damage champion. As far as recommended sets, and obviously you're going to want to build them the best you can. The sets are optional, the sets help, the sets are not required. But first of all, ignore defense sets are great for damage dealers. Savage, Lethal, Instinct, Cruel. Cruel you can get from Clan Boss, so you can usually build up some decent amount of Cruel pretty quickly. Savage is farmable in Fire Knight, but getting good Savage early on can be very difficult. Lethal is a Doom Tower set. You farm that. You're not likely to have a lot of it. Instinct is a Forge Pass set. Very good, very underrated, but it helps you make a fast damage champion And overall, it's a decent set and can help you quite a bit because it can give you some decent 5 and 6-star gear if you craft. Slayer and Merciless, another sets that kind of help you in a similar fashion. They give you additional stats for damage dealing. They can help you ignore some defense. Slayer is a purchasable set. It was originally known as Rathalos. It's now known as Slayer. Merciless is from the Cursed City. Honestly, you're going to struggle with Cursed City most likely if you're struggling finishing some of the faction wars, but you might have some Merciless on even one piece of Merciless. The bonuses Merciless gives you are pretty good. So you can certainly think about doing some Merciless. Other sets, Speed and Perception can be very good because, again, trying to get your champion fast can be helpful, and Perception, of course, can give you additional accuracy as well. A kind of side mention accuracy as well, but honestly, perception is better for a nuker than anything else because perception gives you the accuracy plus the extra speed. Crit rate and crit damage sets could be helpful early on. Crit rate sets one that you can eventually outgrow, but early on when you're building champions, there might be very useful stuff in the crit rate set for you, so go for it. And then finally, bonus damage stat. So you're building an HP nuker, something that gives you a bonus HP can be very helpful. You're building a bonus attack champion, something that gives you bonus attack can be very helpful. Or just anything that gives you additional stats that help you do damage. Indirect damage dealers, crit rate is optional there. Sometimes you actually still need crit rate. For example, a Duke the Pierced, or Duck the Pierced, depending on how you pronounce it, he needs to crit to give his decrease attack on his A2. So you want the crit rate. Whereas a Tyrell technically doesn't need crit rate to land his debuffs, so you don't need it if you're just building him. You're building him for some other stuff. Champions that do poison, like a Eurogrim, don't need crit rate, for example. Champions like that, you're going to be looking for. You don't need the crit rate at all, so you're going to want to focus on HP and defense for some survivability. You're going to want to focus on accuracy because the indirect damage dealers are going to be landing debuffs in general. And you're going to want to focus on the speed to make sure they're getting around to their abilities a little more often. So the speed of 200 plus is very, very helpful. Again, in recommended sets, speed, perception accuracy, and I list those in the same thing because speed and perception have similar roles. Perception and accuracy have similar roles, and obviously that's why perception is really good. Other sets that can be good, something like the reflex set can be very good. The reflex set gives you a time to reset abilities, so you can get around to some of your A2s and A3s a little bit faster. And then relentless just lets you take extra turns. Relentless is great, honestly, on almost any champion, but indirect damage dealers it can be great on. It can also be great on some of your other healers and stuff as well. For building enhancers are a little bit easier to deal with. Again, crit rate is only important if you need crit rate to do something. So some champions need crit rate to be able to land certain debuffs. Some champions do not need crit rate. So it's very hit or miss on that. Otherwise, you're looking for HP defense for some survivability again. You're also looking for the around 200-ish speed. I call it the rule of 200. That's just a good speed to go in a lot of content, at least early to mid game. Accuracy, if you need it for the enhancers. Obviously, if you're landing debuffs, you're going to need the accuracy. So look back at the chart previous in the video for that. You can also build some damage if you need to. And that by needed, either you need it on your team because you don't have enough damage, or in some cases, these enhancers also happen to do decent damage, like your Duck the Pierced, like your Tyrells is good examples for that. Again, the recommended sets, you're looking for your speed, perception, your perception accuracy, your reflex and relentless, which kind of fit in the same area. And I also mentioned regeneration and immortal as well as certainly optional. Those you're generally going to want to save for your revivers and your protectors, but they are viable options for some of your enhancers as well because they'll keep your enhancers alive so that you can keep focused on healing your damage dealers, which are probably a little bit squishier, or you just don't have to worry about healing anybody because everyone stays alive. Okay, for revivers have one job. Honestly, they'll probably have several because most revivers will have a either a kit that can also do some enhancement or a kit that can also do some kind of protection. But generally, your revivers need to survive. So that is where the HP and defense is for survivability. You want them to go fast. And honestly, because a lot of the mid-game revivers that are epics have longer revive cooldowns, the 220 speed is what I actually recommend for a lot of the revivers. If you can get them as fast as 250, go for it. Absolutely. It can be a huge, huge boon for you. Um, But that's where the recommendations for speed and perception. Reflex can be good again because that can reset skills. Relentless to give you additional turns. But honestly, one of the best sets to put on your revivers is this regeneration and immortal. In most cases, there's a couple of champions where it's actually better for relentless. Champions that already have a healing mechanic that don't need the regeneration, they can go in relentless or something else as well, or maybe just go really, really, really fast. But otherwise, especially for the middle of the pack revivers, so some of your epics that are kind of okay and you're only building them just because you need a reviver in the faction, regeneration and immortal is key. And in fact, one of the great ways to deal with faction wars is to build a few, maybe 2 or 3 sets of this regeneration and or immortal that have a good amount of speed, good amount of HP and defense, and that's all you really care about. And then you start moving it from faction to faction to faction as you work on clearing faction wars. So that way your Hoffreys, for example, is an okay reviver in the Skinwalkers. He's not going to steal it all from a Caden, who's also an okay reviver, but in Dark Elves, you can literally take the gear from one and move it onto the other, and as you start finishing the faction wars, you can start moving the revivers out and just running level 20 or even level 19 or 18, and eventually get to a point where you can auto some of the higher levels later on. But for getting those 6 stars, you want some of the best gear you've got, and that's where a regeneration and immortal set can be absolutely imperative on your revivers. And finally, we get to protectors. Protectors are very similar to your revivers. You're looking for them to keep your team alive. So you want HP and defense for some survivability. You want a speed, and honestly, the 220 speed again is good because you want them to get back around to their abilities. So these are your ally protectors. These are your people landing decrease attack. These are people landing decrease speed. But in some cases, these are also champions that you're landing stuns with or control abilities. And that's why some of the recommend sets, in addition to the speed, perception, accuracy, reflex, immortal that you've seen in some of the other listings, this is where a stun or provoke set can be helpful. This is for, and those particular sets are good for champions like a Skull Crown, for example, who has an AoE on every ability, or a Senesha, who's got an AoE A1, or a Basilisk, who's got an AoE A1, or a Soulbond Boyer, who's got an AoE A1. Champions that are good in stun, you'll need stun. Sometimes you may want to put some damage on a champion like that. I wouldn't focus on that early on. If you have the gear to do damage and stun, that's awesome. If you don't, you really want to pick either stun or damage and go that route. And it really will depend on the rest of your team. But again, this is where your healing comes in as well. So another reason to go super fast is if you go fast enough with a protector, you may not need a reviver. It really does depend on what the boss is and overall what your team build is like. But that was how you build protectors, and hopefully this is how you derp. So overall, going back with it, you build your damage dealers, you build your enhancers, you build your revivers, you build your protectors. This gives you an idea of the things to focus on, some of the stats to focus on, and hopefully this has been very helpful and helps you build successful faction war teams. So I've been Bront CatHerder. Hopefully you get a chance to join me on stream. I stream live on Tuesday nights, Thursday nights, and CatHerdays. So go check me out on Twitch. Like and subscribe to the channel and the video. Definitely appreciate it. Leave a comment if this is helping you out. Till the next video, I'll see you later.